So over the course of this session and the next one, we'll be talking about what grief is and what its effects are and where it comes from and where we have been taught in ways that are both obvious and not obvious how to deal with it, and mostly in ways that are ineffective for us. By the end of these sessions, I hope to point us in the direction of some healthier ways of thinking about grief and point us in the direction of some helpful tools that might do that. Because all of us, as we've already experienced and will continue to experience throughout our lives, we all have a relationship to grief. The question is whether or not our relationship to grief is going to be a healthy one or not. The fact of it, though, is inevitable. So we're going to start today. Make sure you have one of those handouts because we're going to be tracking with that today. I'd like to start by reading a couple of quotations to help us enter into this thought about grief. The first one comes from one of my favorite authors and a good Anglican author, Mr. C.S. Lewis, who wrote 2 books on grief. One of them was a philosophical book called The Problem of Pain, in which he deals with the problem of suffering and how to reconcile the problem of suffering with Christian belief. But then in his second book, which was written after the death of his wife, A Grief Observed, Lewis gives us a very different treatment of grief, a very personal and very intimate look into his own grief. Lewis the theologian is someone to be admired, but it is really where his thought begins to shine when he begins to tell us this. And so let's read the introductory lines to C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Yet, I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. Lewis opens his book on what I think is the first step in understanding grief well, and that it is not a straightforward experience. It is a paradox. It is, when we first experience it, a contradiction. It is an experience of contradictory emotions that make us both crave for company and yet to fear company. It is something that makes us want to think about it and yet pushes us away from thinking about it all at once. Let's read this second quote here, which is by another author, Russell Friedman, who is one of the more prolific writers about the subject of grief in the last 50 years. And who is the founder of what is called the Grief Recovery Institute, which is an international organization of folks who are studying intently the subject of grief. He says, "Am I equipped for happiness? Yes, but I am much more familiar with pain. As the direct result of years and years of practice, I am expert at identifying and relating to emotional pain. Happiness is an unwelcome intruder in how I relate to myself." What Friedman is pointing us to here is another introductory thought when we're talking about grief, which is the fact that pain is precise in our lives. It's understandable, it's relatable. Joy and happiness are the unfamiliar things. They are things we experience obliquely, indirectly. They are blurrier. Pain is precise, and joy is blurry. And sometimes when we have established over the years certain ways of relating to pain, it makes us unhospitable to the arrival of joy when it does come about, such that we're skeptical of it. We don't quite welcome it in at the door because we're not sure what to even make of it. So I'd like to let these 2 thoughts bring us in to our discussion of grief this morning. So let's start with a few definitions so we're all on the same page. The first definition I'd like to give us is a working definition for grief, which we'll be using throughout these 2 sessions. So when I say grief, I want to narrow our understanding of it to the emotional level of our lives. We're talking about an emotional experience. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by a change or end in a familiar pattern or behavior. They are the conflicting feelings caused by a change or end in a familiar pattern of behavior. Put another way, we might call grief the normal and natural emotional reaction to loss. Loss is this disruption to the familiar. It doesn't have to be particularly at first understood as a negative thing. It just has to be disruptive. We're going along, things have their rhythms, things have their expected outcomes, and then all of a sudden, one day, they don't. We look to take that next step up the stairway in the dark, and we find there's no step to take there, and we have that experience of falling. This is what grief arises out of, this sense of loss, a disruption of the familiar pattern. Now, as we'll go on to discuss, this is sometimes even positive things. We experience a sense of loss even when the changes to our familiar patterns are good things. And this is what makes grief so confusing sometimes, because it doesn't just arrive out of the sort of expected causes of something quote-unquote bad that happens to us. Sometimes people can be grieving even when they've experienced something quote-unquote good in their lives. As we'll come to find, the emotional experience of these things does not depend on the sort of factual status of the event. The emotional experience of grief can arise even when we're not quote supposed to be feeling grief. This is one of the reasons why we have a hard time identifying and dealing with grief, because we have a whole lot of, in our mind, a whole list of these not supposed to be feeling this way or not supposed to be feeling it in this way. Let's move on to our next definition though, because I want to talk about some things we will not be addressing directly in this class. The second one is we'll talk about complex grief, which is repeated experiences of grief such that their causes and effects become difficult to distinguish, and they morph into a more intricate system of symptoms and of supposed causes and effects. Complex grief is a concept that is more recent in grief studies. It is a kind of grief, a variety of grief that came out of people's similar realizations in the field of trauma studies, where in trauma studies, which again is a very young field in psychology, trauma studies have given us the idea of complex trauma, which is traumas that have been repeated over time, or multiple traumas that have occurred over time that have obscured each of them in particular because of their systemic relationship to one another. So complex trauma has given us the idea of complex grief in in the world of grief studies. We're not going to be dealing as much with complex grief in these studies because it is something that has connections to more elaborate. It's a more elaborate topic, and it's one that is more unfamiliar to most people. Simple grief is one we've all experienced, I would wager. Complex grief is one that is more extraordinary. So we're gonna set that to the side, not because it's unimportant, but simply because it is a little bit more uncommon, and we want to kind of lay a general framework here. The third term we'll define for our session here is unresolved grief, which is defined as undelivered communications of an emotional sort that arise from our emotional reaction to loss. So when we experience this disruption to our familiar pattern of living, and we have these complex and contradictory feelings that define grief arise, we have the choice in that moment whether or not to address our grief and work to start resolving it and completing it, or we leave it unresolved by engaging in any one of these unhealthy ways of dealing with grief we'll go on to discuss. What this causes in us are a series of undelivered things that we need to express at the emotional level. They're undelivered emotional communications. They are any list of things that we wish were different, better, or more. Things we needed to say to that person, things we wish we had not said to that person, things we wish that person had done for us that one time, things we wish that that person had not done those many times. These are the things that ruminate in our emotional dimension, the emotional dimension of our lives, and these are the things that these provoke the experience of emotional pain over the long run. Now, what these things want, what any undelivered communication wants, is to be communicated. It wants to be completed. It wants to go out from us to the other. But for any number of reasons, this becomes impossible at the factual level of our lives. Sometimes people are unreceptive. Sometimes the person we're experiencing the grief over has passed away. Sometimes we don't even have a living memory of them. We just know that they existed in the background of our lives. There's any number of reasons why we may not be able to actually tell these people the things we need to say to express these desires for something to be different, better, or more. And yet at the same time, we still need to say them. And so working on resolving our grief will involve identifying and communicating in an articulable way these unexpressed emotional communications. Which leads us to our fourth term, which is the thing we're looking for in any grief event is what is called emotional completion, which is saying goodbye in an effective way. It's saying goodbye to unmet hopes, dreams, and expectations, those things that we wish were different, better, or more. When we experience a grief event, it changes our relationship to the past. It changes our relationship to the past by creating a rupture that we either deal with or we don't. And if we don't, what it does is it freezes us in one way in that moment where we experience the grief event and doesn't allow us to advance in our emotional life beyond it with that person or that thing. When that happens, we go on sort of ghosting the future. We go on with a kind of ghostly existence as we relate to that thing, and we're sort of strung between 2 points, the point where we experience the grief and the current moment. And we get stretched kind of thinner and thinner and thinner the further we move out from it without dealing with it. What this does at the same time is it alters our expectation for the future. And so we're going to talk about that next as we talk about the effects of grief. I'd like to start with another quote from Russell Friedman here. Incomplete relationships cause us to limit our lives, that can induce us to sabotage good relationships and can encourage us to keep choosing poorly. Unresolved grief can cause us to define ourselves as unworthy of happiness. We must learn how to grieve and complete relationships that have ended or changed. Now let's take a look at what this means. When we experience a grief event in the past, it changes our whole relationship to all of our sense of time, both past, present, and future. So when the event happens in the past, and we keep living past it, it changes our relationship to the present. So if we are standing here in the present, part of us remains frozen in this past grief moment, so long as we leave it unresolved. As a result of that, we are people who increasingly ruminate on this event. We are people who increasingly fixate on it, trying to understand it. Now, let's remember always that when we're talking about a grief event, we're talking about something that is emotionally uncommunicated here. And so all of our after-the-fact analysis of the grief event isn't actually getting at the thing that we really want. What we really want is to say the thing at the emotional level that was left unsaid, to communicate those undelivered emotional communications. And so all of us who then fixate on this event and say, how could I have made that better? How could I have made that better? How could I have not been there? How could they have not been there? Why did I trust that person? And we ask ourselves all these questions about our past grief events. It causes us to ruminate in a way on the past that does not actually advance us in our ability to resolve that event at the emotional level where the pain is coming from. What it does at the same time is it changes our horizon of the future. Our horizon of the future becomes a way of trying to offset and prevent that same event from happening in the future. As we are split between these two moments in the past, we see on the one hand the thing that we should have known better. I should have been able to prevent that. I should have done better, which is not helping us in any way. Well, at the same time, we look to the future as an open field of possibilities of the same thing happening again. So when we look to the past at the thing we can't change, and we look to the future to a world that increasingly becomes the place where this is only going to keep happening to me, this is only going to happen again, we divide our attention anywhere but the one place where we can actually affect meaningful change, which is in the present, where we are. And so what this does to us is it turns the past into a nightmare that continually gets sucked into the black hole of our grief events. And it turns the future into a bleak world that becomes only possible of delivering more of the same kind of events. And so what we eventually doing is we eliminate the present altogether, because we become so divided between these two things that can only absorb attention and never deliver anything back to us. They take our life, they don't give any life. And so ends up just sort of ping-ponging back and forth between past and future at some point. When we do this, we end up having a sense of living spectrally in our present. We live like ghosts in our present. I work with high schoolers, and they've delivered a very helpful verb to me that has helped to explain that. They call it ghosting, which has a very different definition in their use of it. It's when you sort of just disappear from someone's life and like cut off all communication without any preamble, which is disturbing in its own way. But it has delivered a kind of helpful concept for understanding what we become the more we leave our grief unresolved. We end up sort of feeling detached from our present. We end up being in places but not really being in places. We end up having the feeling of being around others and being in relationship to others, and yet we're still feeling, we feel kind of just like there's something not here. This is that experience of the invisible blanket between the world and me that Lewis was talking about. I am here, but I'm not really here. The goal of grief recovery, when we begin to actually address the grief, is to diminish this process and return us back to the present again, so that we can actually live our lives again. And so this is the problem, this is the effect. Unhappiness in the middle of grief will come from any attempt to be in any moment but the present again. We cannot change the past. We can't really prevent the future. What we can take meaningful responsibility for and where we can actually affect some meaningful change is coming back here to the horizon of time where we can actually take ownership of this experience and start to heal from it. So let's turn our attention now to some sources of grief. If you'll turn to the back page, you'll see a rather extensive list there, and this is just a brief sample. So let's take a look at that. Let's scan that for a moment and highlight some of that. Would you mind passing one more of those up here? Thank you. Up here. Yeah. Thank you. There you go. Now, some of them are ones we might say, oh, of course, that's a grief event. Others of them we may be more surprised to find on here as grief events. One of the ones that is sometimes surprising is to see marriage, getting married, as a potential grief event. But if we remember that a loss is at its basic level a disruption of the familiar pattern, then a loss event can be registered when one enters into a new sort of state of being, a new way of being. Either getting married, getting unmarried again, any of these things can do this. Whenever we have a sense that the expected pattern gets intruded upon, this is when things begin to potentially register as losses. Now, some of these things can be really good. Changes in residence, changes in schools, this can be a good thing. Very often, and I've been thinking about this in a brand new way since I've started thinking about it through a grief lens for the last few years. When I work with high schoolers, I work with high schoolers, and I started noticing about 5 years ago that reliably around March of each year, my students would have a radical change in emotional behavior, almost collectively. This was the most accentuated, the most obvious with the seniors. It was immediately after their college acceptances and rejections had come in. But it wasn't about the nature of it turned out not to be immediately about where they got in and where they didn't get in. That registered as its own kind of experience. But what it was a different thing as I started to look at it through this lens. I started to realize that they were collectively mourning. They realized that the way that they had been, the thing that they had only known, was about to suddenly change. That in a sort of figurative sense, their way of being was dying. And they couldn't put words on it, but they felt it happening nonetheless. They didn't understand what was happening. But what it did was and the way I started to notice it in this lens was I started to notice them grow very vacant. Sometimes we call it senioritis. Now, there are forms of it that are just genuine sloth, genuine forms of sloth, right? And as a moral theologian, I'm like, yep, that's sloth, it's right there, But there was something else to it, because I noticed it across the board, even in a wide swath of students that had never demonstrated any sort of proclivity to sloth before. We might have asked yeah, senioritis, it's really contagious. Even the diligent students are afflicted by it. And I started thinking that's not a good explanation for this. So what I realized what was happening as I started to have conversations one-on-one with my students was I was realizing that they were grieving. They couldn't say why, and they felt disenfranchised from their grief too, because it was a good thing they were experiencing, right? They were going to college. This was the thing they had worked for. They were going to graduate high school. They were supposed to feel happy, but they didn't. At least not completely. They felt happy and they felt deeply sad. Come on in, have a seat. Yeah. Now, this I would propose is when we come to an experience of grief, let's take this for a moment and understand and kind of relate to one or more of these events here. So if we look at this list here of potential sources of grief, and again, this is just a sort of sampling list. There are plenty more I'm sure we can think of. But if we look at these things as potential grief events, we realize that we experience losses pretty much all the time. Things are constantly being disrupted for us. Now, how we come to deal with this is a significant thing, and I'd like to turn our attention now to the ways we've been taught how to think about our loss events, because all of us looking at these might have had one moment or another where we said, oh, you're not supposed to grieve with that on any one of these things. Going on vacation? But try it. I know some people have had that in here. I've had that in here, where suddenly you're dumped out of a pattern into an unfamiliar world where you're just supposed to relax. How dare you? How dare I? So let's talk about how we've been taught. Looking below there, we have to start with how we form beliefs in the first place. So how do we form our beliefs about grief? We form them mostly by looking at those who have taught us them, looking at it, those who have modeled it for us and those who have put directly input. We learn it from our families primarily, our family of origin. We learn how to grieve from the people around us. Now, this can be good if you have a culture that supports healthy grief recovery. This can be disastrous and pandemic if we live in a culture that has real hang-ups about this, and we live in one of those latter cultures. So let's look at a couple stats here. By age 15, which is a freshman in high school, a child has been told about 23,000 times not to feel bad. Now let's look at where this comes from. Let's look at the context of that being said, because it might sound to us like, wow, someone can't have said that to someone that many times. But when we experience loss events, let's put ourselves in that imaginative space for a second. Imagine the last time we felt like we were grieving, and someone said one form or another of the phrase, "Don't feel bad." Sometimes it's like, "It's okay. It's okay. Be okay." Now, we start telling this to children at a very young age. And as someone who's raising a young child right now, like I see that I immediately feel the pull. I feel the trigger to tell my child this, right? She's crying. Oh my gosh, she's crying. I'm panicked. She's crying. What do I want? I want you to feel better right now. Why do I want you to feel better? Because I love you and want you to feel better, but I also want to feel better right now. I'm freaking out a little bit because you're freaking out right now. So what do I say? It's okay, it's okay, it's okay. It's not okay. Some things are okay, something is not okay. So let's take that moment. What do we say? What should we say? What do we think?
I understand.
Yeah.
Or don't understand.
Yeah. I think that's a better way of going about it. Because we don't tell someone that the thing they're feeling is not the thing they're feeling. We don't tell them to just get over it in the moment. Now, here's a flip side to show a little bit of the absurdity of telling someone this. Let's say someone is going through one of these grief events right here. Let's say that they're going through one of these, and we go to them and say some form of the phrase, "It's okay." Now, I would imagine that, let's go into reverse world for a moment. Let's go into the opposite world where everything in a person's life is going awesome, right? Let's say we go to the same 5-year-old who on a sad day, we would say, "It's okay, calm down, it's okay." We might say to that child who's at their birthday party and is having an uproariously good time, and we just kind of sidle up next to them and say, "You know, some things aren't okay right now." Like, you're having a good time, but, it's going to get worse. You're turning 5 today, and that's great. You got the toy you wanted, but you're getting shots tomorrow. You don't know that, but it's going to happen. Now, let's flip that back, and then let's run it through our normal script, right? Child is crying at their 5th birthday, right? You're like, "It's going to get better. It's going to get better. It's going to get better. Be okay. It's okay. It's okay." Now, this is one way we sort of disenfranchise each other from our grief, our sense of grief. That's not to say that that's not to say that, in the great scheme of things, at the factual level of things, that, generally speaking, in the equilibrium of what is going well to what is not going well, that things are generally in an okay state around this person. That's not denying that. But it is not at the emotional level. It's at the emotional level that we're experiencing the grief, and it doesn't help anybody to say to them that your circumstances are fine, stop feeling that way. Because they are feeling that way. And feelings contradict facts all the time. That's just what they do sometimes. So when we address it, we have to take it as it is. We can't just kind of rip it from the emotional sphere up into the factual sphere and say, "Your facts are fine, stop feeling." That's to pull a person apart. It's to pull ourselves apart when we tell it to ourselves. So belief systems. By age 15, again, a freshman in high school, about 95% of our belief system has been instilled by that point. We typically think it's older, right? I've been working in the secondary ed for a while now, and we used to think that you had until about freshman year of college to do this. It's getting younger every year that your kind of primary belief system is instilled. It's earlier than that now. It's probably the beginning of high school, if not a little bit earlier than that, around 14. Most of what our operating beliefs are have been instilled by that point. And so if by that same age, someone has been told, when you're feeling sad, don't feel sad, that's what they believe. That's their primary belief at that point. And even if we adapt to more sophisticated ways of dealing with grief, more healthy ways of dealing with grief, we're working against a primary belief system by that point. So that by the time I get them in high school, it's kind of there, and we're building on a foundation that's already been laid. We're not laying the foundation at that point. So let's talk about some of the popular mythology about grief. The things that we, by the time we're about 15, have become masters of living. The kind of operating beliefs about grief that most of us get by the time we reach our mid-teen years. All right, so popular myths about grief there at the bottom of the page. The first one, don't feel bad, which again is that another form of that, it's okay. The second one is replace the loss, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this one as we go through it. Replacing the loss. So I'm going to write these up as we go along. So the first one is don't feel bad. Now, we don't say it that way. We say it in a really nice voice, right? Don't feel bad. They're there. They're there. Feel better. We tell someone, we tell them some form of this. The second one is replace the loss. Now, that sounds cold until we put it in the fun, plucky, kind ways that we usually say it. So let's talk about that. Replacing the loss comes in some form of saying like, let's say during a breakup, where this is a popular one, right? Someone just broke up with their significant other. What happens? We get together for a glass of wine that night, and we say, you know what? I'm sorry that happened, but there's plenty of fish in the sea. You'll find someone else. Not so good. Why is that? In light of what we've said so far. Actual question.
It doesn't acknowledge the pain.
Right. It doesn't acknowledge the loss. It says move on from the loss. But remember what happens when we move on from an unresolved loss. It's inviting that person to ghost their own life in the future. We don't want that for them, but it's a short-term fix. It seems like a short-term fix for their loss. Replace the loss. Get a new one, right? You lost that thing? Go get a new one. The third one, grieve alone. This is one we often tell to ourselves. I don't imagine many people in this room would actually say this to someone else, but I have heard it said to people before, which is, and typically it comes from certain regions and certain generations, and you get this thing like, you know what, you're bothering people right now, like what you're feeling right now, like it's bumming everyone out, Now we mostly just tell that to ourselves, right? Like if I'm in a room and I'm feeling sad, I have a kind of continuous low-grade sadness, and sometimes I think like, I feel like I'm just dragging everybody down. I should probably just go be alone. Now, what's the problem with this? Yeah.
It might help to just talk to somebody. Expressing yourself is a good way to let it go.
Exactly. Again, we have unexpressed emotional communications. And while it is possible to do that, to articulate those things alone, it is highly unlikely. We really do need other people to process and complete grief. To grieve alone, I mean, we think like, oh yeah, my grief is somehow ruining the group, and I need to just go take it elsewhere. Sometimes we do that for others too. We tell that to others, even if we do it sort of implicitly. We say like, oh, that person's going through something right now. We just don't invite them to things. We're like, no, they're going through something right now. Let's let them chill right now. Again, contrary to what actually will bring health. Let's talk about another one. This is one of mine that I continually work against. Is be strong. For fill in the blank. Who is it in your mind? Think about it right now. Who is that person that whenever you're feeling grief, you need to just shove that down and get over it because of that person, the person who you need to be strong for, right? I need to be strong for my spouse, my kids, my friends, my coworkers, my employees, etc. Be strong for them. That's a noble sounding thing at first. And that's what one of the things that makes this a particularly dangerous one when it becomes a grief myth that we adopt. Because being strong for someone sounds, at least on the surface, like self-sacrifice, and that's noble. But what's happening here, right? The more we say, be strong for X, the more, again, we deal in this. The more we deal with this, the less we become this person. And so what's end up going to be happening in our relationship with the people we're being strong for?
Not really present.
Yeah, we're going to become decreasingly present over time for those people we're being strong for, and we'll end up not being strong for them because it'll just vitiate us from the inside out. And it'll have diminishing returns the longer we adopt that myth. This is the one where you sort of have a kind of where you have a balance. You have like sometimes an overwrought stoicism, and it eventually just collapses on itself, or it just explodes, one way or the other. Because again, we can only suppress and repress, only suppress uncommunicated emotional things for so long. This is another really popular one, number 5 here. Just give it time. Who has heard the phrase, time heals all wounds? It does not. And actually, cognitive science is starting to bear this out with actual data. It turns out that when we experience grief events, it impacts the part of the brain that deals with our sort of executive functioning, our ability to plan and strategize and organize. This is why people who are experiencing grief events should be careful getting behind the wheel of a car. And this is why people who are experiencing grief events feel like they've suddenly become unable to run their adult lives because, frankly, they are dealing with a kind of temporary low-grade brain impairment, for lack of a better term. So giving it time doesn't help because the grief event, as it gets registered in the brain, it gets recycled in the brain again as the brain refreshes itself at the cellular level. It does not go away with time. The brain works around it eventually, but it stays there, and it will change the way we process things. It continues to affect us over time, even if it happened many years ago. The brain is an amazingly adaptive thing, and it can work a little bit around it, but the more we do this, the more we create a field of landmines in our own psychology that makes our brain sort of work double time to try and work around all these unresolved grief events in our history. And again, this is another reason at the cognitive level why this happens, because our brain is working double time to work around all of these unresolved emotional events. And because of that, we have less attention span, less actual focus, quantity of focus to be able to dedicate to any one thing. And so we end up feeling a little bit blurrier. We get to the end of the day and we're like, I don't even remember what I did today. We pull up into the driveway and say, I don't remember how I got home. The two really significant fender benders I've been in happened unsurprisingly in the wake of 2 major grief events. I was like, I suddenly can't drive a car, apparently. Now, that wasn't what it was, but that's what it felt like, because again, this is what was happening to me. Here's another one. This is a good one for Southern California people, especially driven types. Keep busy. Now, for me, as I look back on my own biography, I think I can look at different sort of educational versions of this, and especially being an educator, there's always a way to justify doing this. And I look back and think, I'm pretty sure that one of my graduate programs was actually just me trying to cope with a massive unresolved grief at this point. I'd like to think that it was for nobler causes than that. But if I'm being really honest, I'd say the majority of why that happened, why I chose to pursue a certain educational opportunity, was because I was trying to distract myself for a few years from having to deal with unresolved emotional pain. Doesn't mean that something good didn't come out of it, but it does mean that was the reason why I was doing it. I can't deny that. Now, if we think back on this, there are lots of good things we do to keep ourselves busy. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we just binge 3 seasons of The Office in order to keep busy from dealing with our grief. None of us knows anything about that. Yes. But a lot of the times we do things that are quote unquote productive. Good. I've known people that started companies to do this. I've known people that have gone and got more education. I've known people that have done great philanthropic activities, gone on missions trips. I went to Biola University, where doing missions was a really a thing that was stressed very highly. And as I look back again through the lens of some later experiences, I think Yeah, I knew a number of people that did this because they were coping with like relational loss. They were coping with leaving home for the first time in their lives. They were coping with a loss of friendships, loss of relationships, and that was driving them to pursue sort of vocational work because they were trying to get away from dealing with their own interior life. And this is especially dangerous in church settings because I've also known a lot of pastors that have done this. And a lot of pastors, they kind of do a lot of really great things. This is the classic kind of over-functioning pastor, which we kind of baptize. We baptize their overworking themselves because of this. We're like, oh yeah, he's a busy guy. He does a lot of good things. But it does help us if we want to be emotionally healthy as a congregation, to sometimes maybe even ask an over-functioning minister of any sort, like, how you really doing? And having that conversation, because I've seen it be this before, just the kind of keep busy myth. The last one we'll talk about is a little more ambiguous, but it's still present, and that is others are responsible. This is usually a later stage myth. It either happens right out of the gate as a sort of reaction, or it develops as a later stage thing where we become so tired from this process up here that eventually we lose the sense to claim any agency over our ability to heal from our grief anymore. We just kind of lie down at the feet of our grief and we say, like, I can't do anything here. And it even revises our sort of understanding of the past to where, like, I didn't have anything to do with it and I can't do anything about it now. We start to lose, because we start to ghost the present, we start to lose our sense of self. We start to lose our sense of agency as a result of losing our sense of self. We lose our sense of having a meaningful ability to make any change and to move our cause in any healthy direction. And so others become both responsible for the initial cause, and they become responsible for getting me out of it. And this is where sometimes we can develop a victim mentality, where I cannot do anything helpful. I'm not even 1% able to meaningfully and positively affect my outcome here. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing that's probably not on your program, but
sure.
The common thing that I get as a myth to dealing with grief,
Yeah.
that other people say and that I internalize in the case of a death is, he's in a better place.
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
on the one hand is maybe true.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, not only now am I feeling grief because of the loss, but I'm also feeling guilt over wishing that he were like here in a worse place.
That's absolutely right. I'm so glad you brought that up. It's a sort of a Christianizing of the myth of don't feel bad, and there's always a reason for it, right? And in Christian circles, I've noticed this one especially, where it's like, don't feel bad. Well, why shouldn't I feel bad? They died. It's like, well, they're in a better place. And you just need to accept that and realize that. It's like, first of all, like, what do you know? Like, honestly, like if I scrutinize that claim to any extent, I'm going to get to the bottom of your sort of evidence base for even making that claim in the first place. But beyond that, that's not helpful, right? Because it disenfranchises you from your experiences of grief. Saying he's in a better place means stop being sad now. Because if you just realized that somehow, you'd feel better about it. But remember, first of all, the emotional experience of grief isn't necessarily tied to the sort of factual quality of the moment, right? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that someone is in a better place. Let's just say we know somehow through some sort of clairvoyance that, yes, they are in a better place now. We can still feel sad that they're not here, because they're gone from us. Our familiar's been upended. Our familiar's been disrupted. That's a loss. Our emotions, they don't attend to that all the time. They don't attend to what is actually there. So next week we're going to talk a lot about how this comes to bear on the church and how in the church we do this. To give us a little bit of a preview of this, one of the things we always do, we do in church around grief events, let's take a primary grief event like death, is the church right now is sort of divided. If we look at the church, not our parish, but like if we look at the church kind of broadly, and especially in this culture around us here, there's a kind of division of understanding on how we deal with grief, right? Now, I would propose, and I will propose in our session next week, that the Requiem service is actually a healthy way of confronting and processing grief, because it allows you to feel sad. It almost calls you to feel sad, because that's what humans feel when people die. It's a very human service. It doesn't draw us. Sometimes we've talked a lot about today about trying to yank our emotions into the intellectual or the sort of factual realm, where we shame them for not being in alignment with reason or something like that. But we can also, as Christians, yank our emotions up into the sort of spiritual realm, where we sort of moralize them, saying, like, you're not being faithful enough. You're not having enough faith. You're not praying enough. If you just had more faith, you wouldn't feel sad anymore. That is not true. But in Christian services of death right now, one of the other phenomenon we deal with is the kind of contrast between like a requiem service or a funeral proper and something more like what is now sort of in recent years starting to be called like a celebration of life, which, you know, has a range of forms, but there is a form of a celebration of life where we tell people, don't be sad. Be happy today. Rejoice. Celebrate. It's what they would have wanted. It's, again, don't feel bad. Don't feel bad. Which ends up having to do with sort of medicating the anxiety rather than actually going to the root causes of it. We all crave for the hope of resurrection. And there is no hope of resurrection if there is no problem of death. Yes?
If other people feel uncomfortable, and that's why when they ask you, how are you feeling today? They expect you to say,
I'm fine.
I'm feeling great.
Yep.
Because they don't want to deal with someone else's grief.
Oh, it's for sure.
Sadness.
Yeah.
They don't know how to.
That's true. So this is why it is significant that the work begins with us. Because again, the best way to meaningfully affect a kind of cultural system is by starting at ground zero here with all of us. Right? So as we go into session 2 next week, and I want to leave some time for question and answers today. As we go into session 2 next week, we're going to talk about how this comes to bear on the church and in our Christian life. We're going to talk a little bit more about our ineffective ways of dealing with it and how we can start moving in the direction of some healthier ways of resolving grief. Because there are some meaningful things we can all immediately put about doing that will actually help us to become healthier grievers, which then creates a kind of ecosystem of healthier grievers that then seeds the rest of the relationships that we have and begins to kind of germinate healthy grieving out beyond our walls here. That's what we want to do. So that's what we're heading toward in session 2. So I'm going to stop there in terms of content and just kind of open the floor for the remaining few minutes to question and answers. Yes, Adriana.
You touched a little bit on this before, but it really, by talking about somebody who's going through something, and they'll say, "Oh, she's got such a good attitude. She never cries, never complains, never feels sorry for herself." And I'm like, okay, so I'm gonna go to grieve alone.
Yep.
And because that person apparently is doing it right, and I'm doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like you elevate this person. So
We praise that.
Me who's crying here in the corner.
Well, it's like, I'm not sharing anything now.
Yeah.
I'm not sharing anything anymore.
Why do we make that the standard? Like that's the
Yeah.
how you should.
It keeps what we think, it keeps the peace, we think. What it really does is it just pushes the conflict underground, and it always comes back out in weird ways, right? So I've dealt, for the last decade plus with teenagers, right? They're not good at it yet, but they're getting good at it in terms of these myths, right? They're not good at them yet. It still breaks out a lot. You have teenagers, you know how that goes, right? Like you can see them starting to adopt these myths, but at the same time, they're not skilled enough at it yet. They're not like all of us who have had many more years of practice, right? Where we can almost pull off the illusion sometimes, unless it's really bad. But they are messier, right? So I watch teenagers do this, and I watch my high schoolers do this, and they will try on their sort of myth of choice, and then it collapses, and then they have a crisis. That's a good thing, right? Because then you can come in and say, hey, that wasn't working. That doesn't work. Let's do something different. But when we eventually we not only adopt these for ourselves, but then we contribute to systems where this sort of unhealthy grief is elevated and even socially rewarded, right? We sort of contribute to socially rewarding improper emotional unhealth. And that's where it gets really bad for all of us, right? Because then we're not only competing against something that we're inclined to believe and maybe ingrained to believe, but also we're having to actively say no to these things that we want to belong to in some way, right? So we're fighting a lot more impulses. We're fighting a desire to belong, even though the desire to belong is leading us to a place where we're going to become more emotionally unhealthy. So that's why it's so important for us to create communities within cultures like that, where healthy emotional processing is a good thing and is elevated as an asset and as a desired thing, as a virtue, because then it gives a new home for that desire to belong while we're actually learning how to emote properly. Yeah, Sarah.
So I know you mentioned like a requiem is an expression in our tradition for the loss of someone. But is there in kind of the liturgy or rhythms of prayer, what kind of structures do we have for just general laments?
Yeah, I think in the course of the church year, you have a number of days that permit this. But I think the one that comes most immediately to mind is Ash Wednesday is one of them, right? Which is confronting the fact of mortality. All Saints Day is another one. All Souls Day is another one, where we confront the kind of gritty reality of life in the fall, right? All Souls Day is essentially a collective funeral for all of our dead that we have every year. And it's an extremely austere service, a somber service. You know, we chant the ancient chant, the Day of Wrath, right? Which is about the profound brokenness of the world and its abject need for a savior. The Christian faith, Christianity is not an enemy of grief. It assumes it as a primary premise. If the world isn't broken, we don't need a savior. Those who are healthy have no need of a physician, only the sick, right? And we're all sick. So, yeah, that's right. But I think I think to tie it together with Adriana's comment, the culture part of this too is significant because I'm originally from the South, right? I'm originally from Texas, and like to come back to your point back here, there's a kind of cultural greeting, right? It's like, how y'all doing, right? And it's, I'm great, right? The more great you are, you have to give more A's in the middle, right? I'm great. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Oh, there's an inhibition about expressing negative emotion. And that's hidden under a kind of veneer of gentility, right? When you say like instead of saying like, oh my gosh, that's a terrible thing that happened to that person, like, oh, bless their heart.
Bless their heart. Yeah.
Bless their heart. Mercy. Right? Really what we want to say is, I have no idea what to say right now. Like, that is unspeakably horrible. Right? It's like, oh, bless them. Bless their heart. How y'all doing? We're great. Yeah. Out here, it's fine. I'm fine. I'm doing fine. Just fine. Next week, we'll talk about the iceberg of fine, where fine kind of sits hovering on the surface, bobbing up and down, and getting increasingly weighed down by the iceberg of grief that is under the surface. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, Lisa.
Just to come back to your comment about how we're unprepared in a lot of ways as culture. I work at Orange Coast College, and so we've had an awful lot of tragedy and
Yeah.
loss and grief and even things that didn't get in the paper in a real concentrated way. And so I've had the experience of watching an organization and young people, trying to confront this, and that they had grief counseling as an example, but I heard a lot of, oh, it's going to be okay, as opposed to, which, is not a bad thing to say, but what I didn't hear, and we had a lot of celebrations of life and things like that, and there's something just really that doesn't work, just observationally, that doesn't work about celebrating someone's life
Right.
when, you know, you haven't had the chance to deal with it. And what we hear from the students a lot, or observe, you know, is a lot about, oh, I'm good, it's all good, it's gonna be okay. But they're not, and, you know, our staff, everybody, there's no room for confronting the fear part.
Right.
And, you know, you mentioned it, I mean, it came up in the Lewis part, but I think that's really important because it somehow comes out to be like you're thinking about yourself.
Yep.
When you're not supposed to be,
Yep.
you know, or something like that. And
Right. Be strong for others.
I think it's a real fundamental part of grief. So I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about that fear part, where
Mm-hmm.
what we are thinking about ourselves, right?
Yep.
And
Where it actually leads us. Yeah.
what does that mean? You know,
Mhm.
if somebody can die inexplicably like that, or a whole family.
Right.
What does that mean about my life, right? That's
Mhm.
scary, beyond being just terrible.
You know, we as humans, we have different dimensions to how we exist, right? There's the emotional dimension, there's the intellectual dimension, there's the spiritual dimension. All of these things exist in integrity, in a harmony, in a sort of symbiosis. We're just created as multifaceted beings, right? We have more than one thing going on at any given time. So when we contribute to the wholesale neglect of one of those things, it has a systemic problem that we've created. It doesn't just stay isolated to the area of neglect. It bleeds out into the other areas as well, right? That's why I can have honor students, if they're grieving, they suddenly can't do their homework, right? And they think, I'm losing my mind. I'm like, no, you're not losing your mind, right? But the thing is, before we can start to restore equilibrium again, we actually have to go to the place, we have to go back to the actual place we're afraid to go. And we actually have to go back and find those things that were left uncommunicated. We have to communicate them, and we have to say goodbye. That's the thing I think we're deeply afraid of, saying goodbye, right? This is the thing I think that distinguishes a celebration of life in the kind of on the side of the celebration of life services that I think are not helpful, from services like funerals and requiems that are helpful, and even the celebration of life ones that actually attend to those things, is, do they say goodbye in a meaningful way? Like an actual goodbye. Because that is a goodbye. And until we can't be comforted by the hope of resurrection until we've been confronted by the problem of mortality, right? But we want that second part first, right? We rush to that to the expense of the first part, at the expense of the first part. So we're going to talk about that fear. Why are we afraid to go back to that place? Yeah. Yes. Last question.
Well, just a comment. Past generations, I think, had an advantage in having standard forms for how long grief.
Yes. This is a great point. Go on. Yeah.
Often marked by the way you're dressed. Because undeniably, to the extent that grief involves suffering, you do want it to pass for others.
Yes.
And when somebody tells you, I'm doing better now, you rejoice with them.
Yes.
That can easily be perceived as thinking, you ought to hurry up.
Yep.
But if everybody accepts the same conventions that it could take a year by which your grieving
Right.
is even marked by how you're dressed, nobody's going to hurry you through that.
Yeah.
And I think this transcends a lot of cultures. It was true of ours until just the last 100 years or so.
Yeah. I think that. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Getting rid of the time issue is a big benefit to grieving.
I think that's a wonderful observation, and I think where we talk about how these things, how we sort of contribute to cultural conventions that disenfranchise us from our experience of grief, or honor it. Because I think you're right. I think there have been, there still are cultures that do the opposite of this. I think a lot of the problems we're talking about are located. They're not universal, right? I think the practice. Yeah, I think you're right. The practice of dressing in black, or having a black tie or a ribbon or something that marks as like, oh, they're grieving, right? And giving it the dignity of a long time, right? We're going to give you a year. And then we're going to commemorate that. We're going to have a season that's marked on both ends, right? I've done services actually before that were of that nature for folks who are from cultures that still observe those traditions, where we had the requiem and funeral service, and then a year later we all got together again and had a sort of commemorative service that marked the end of the grieving season and a reminder of the hope of resurrection. I really would like to see those kinds of things come back or be created in our midst, because again, we're not a good grieving culture. Yeah.
Real quick, I grew up in a culture that makes exactly what you're explaining,
Mm-hmm.
and that when someone passed away,
Yeah.
women wore black for the entire year.
Yeah.
And when someone passed away, there was of course a formal, very somber service at the church.
Yeah.
The 7th day there was another service. On the 40th day there was a third.
That's beautiful.
Service, and eventually at the end of the year was another one as well.
Yeah.
And during that year, that family did not send Christmas cards,
Yeah.
did not receive Christmas cards, did not go to birthday parties.
And everyone got it.
anything like that. Yeah.
Everyone gets it. Yeah.
Especially if you're initially in shock.
Oh, for
at a
sure.
loss. You can't even process it right away, so it takes time. And then you need that time later maybe for people to be present with you, but when you couldn't be
Yeah.
present when the actual event happens.
Yeah.
or-
Absolutely.
We're fighting a tension, and I think we'll close with this. We're fighting a tension, I think, in ideas of the human person at a foundational level. On the one side, we have, I think, a dignified vision of the human person that's reflected in practices like this, that see death as death being this sort of stage of being this event that is common to all, is still dignified because the human is dignified, and we say it's worthy of disrupting the sense of things. Even in a community, it's worthy of disrupting the sense of things to observe this, to really observe this. I think right now that's at war with a vision of the human person that is more functionally defined and more productively defined. A lot of diligent students I've had have come to me in times of grief and said something like, "I need to stop feeling this way so I can start achieving again." And I'm like, and I say, I'm like, you need to dignify your grief more than that. You're not just a producer. But again, so long as we hold our sort of vision of humanity as productively oriented, we'll never grieve well because it's always going to get in the way, right? So we'll sequester it as much as we can. We'll make it invisible as much as we can so it doesn't mess up everyone's productivity, right? But some things are worth disrupting productivity for. We're not producers at the foundational level. We're persons. So we'll close with that. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face to shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace this day and forevermore. Amen. Thank you all for coming. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.